For nearly 2,000 years, Christians have debated one extraordinary question. Have we understood what the apostles actually wrote, or only what we've been taught to believe? For generations, this became the picture many believers imagined. A sudden disappearance, ordinary life interrupted without warning. But did this picture come from Scripture, or did Scripture become viewed through this picture? Every investigation begins with the same question. If the rapture is such a central belief, where does the Bible actually use the word? The answer surprised me, because the search led somewhere completely unexpected. Many assume these records hold the definitive truth. If we're going to understand Paul's message, we have to begin where he began. Not with later traditions, but with original words written to the believers in Thessalonica. Because understanding the language is only the first step. Understanding what his audience heard is where the real investigation began. Before we ask what these words mean to us, we should first ask what they meant to the people who heard them for the very first time. Because every investigation begins with the original audience, not the modern reader. Imagine hearing these words for the very first time. No prophecy conferences, no study Bibles, no centuries of debate. Only a small church waiting to hear a letter from the Apostle Paul. This is the passage at the center of the entire discussion. Before we decide what it means, let's pay careful attention to what it actually says. Because sometimes the smallest details become the most important evidence. Notice what Paul chooses to describe. A descending Lord, the voice of an archangel, and the trumpet of God. If you encountered these words for the first time, would your first impression be silence? Now let's hear from another witness. Jesus described his coming like lightning, stretching from east to west. Now, lightning doesn't hide itself. So what picture was Jesus inviting his listeners to imagine? Investigations become clearer when every witness is heard together. Matthew, Revelation, different authors, yet strikingly similar descriptions. Are these describing the same moment from different vantage points? Let's pause before we draw any conclusions. Trumpets, an archangel's voice, lightning across the sky, every eye seeing him. If these were the only passages you had, what picture would they naturally create in your mind? One detail kept appearing, again and again. The clouds weren't introduced revelation, they were already woven throughout the scriptures. So before we decide what the clouds mean, shouldn't we first ask what the people meant to first read them? Daniel's vision is extraordinary, but notice direction of journey. The Son of Man comes with the clouds and is brought before the Ancient of Days. So here's the question. Is he coming down to earth or approaching the Father's throne? The more I searched, the more one pattern kept appearing. At Sinai, in the wilderness, over the tabernacle, the cloud always accompanies God's revealed presence. If that's Xteredage, could that patterns of prophecy be pointing us back to something we've seen before? Jesus wasn't speaking to people unfamiliar with the scriptures. He was speaking to men who had grown up hearing how God revealed his presence throughout Israel's history. So when they heard, coming with the clouds, what picture do you think entered their minds first? These were the believers who lived closest to the apostles. Their faith grew beneath the shadow of the Roman Empire, where following Christ often came at great personal cost. So rescue from tribulation or faithfulness through it? I expected to find different voices, but I kept hearing the same message. Jesus prepared his followers for tribulation. Paul strengthened churches to tribulation. Peter encouraged believers not to be surprised by it. If this was the expectation of apostles, what hope were they actually teaching to hold on to? The more I followed the evidence, the clearer their hope became. Again and again, the apostles pointed believers toward resurrection, not simply escape. Perhaps the greatest promise wasn't leaving the world behind, but the King returning to make all things new. History sometimes preserves details we no longer notice. In the Roman world, welcoming a returning king often meant out to meet him before accompanying him in honor. Could Paul's first readers have recognized this familiar image the moment they heard his letter aloud? Paul wasn't writing into a cultural vacuum. His readers lived in a world where welcoming a returning ruler was a familiar public celebration. Could that shared experience help explain the picture Paul is painting when he spoke of the Lord? Every generation reads Scripture through the world it inhabits. As wars, uncertainty, and global fear intensified, so did the longing for rescue. Could history have influenced but how they interpreted prophecy itself? History reminds us that conviction and sincerity often walk hand in hand. In 1804, thousands genuinely believed Christ would on a specific day. When they questioned wasn't whether their faith mattered, but whether their interpretation had been mistaken. History reveals a pattern that extends far beyond one event. When deeply held expectations collide with reality, our first instinct is often to irrespect the evidence before questioning the belief. Perhaps the greatest safeguard to let evidence keep shaping our understanding. After following every trail, one pattern keeps returning. Jesus spoke often about his return, but even more often about how his followers should live until that day. Perhaps readiness was never meant to begin with predicting the future, but with faithfully living in the present. After everything we've uncovered, one message rises above the rest. Jesus spent far more time teaching his followers how telling them when to leave. Perhaps true readiness isn't measured by how accurately we predict his return, but by how faithfully we believe he comes. When I stepped back from the individual passages, a much larger picture began to emerge. The story of Scripture begins with God dwelling among humanity, and it ends the same way. Perhaps the Bible's greatest promise was never that creation would be abandoned, but that its rightful king would to restore it. Every investigation reaches a point where the evidence has been gathered. What we've explored doesn't remove every question, but it may help us ask better ones. Because in the end, the greatest question isn't whether Christ will return, it's whether we'll follow the truth wherever it leads.